Alex, the Kai Havertz at Chelsea at the moment, that version of the player I saw at Leverkusen, he comes across a little bit like a member of an orchestra who doesn't quite fit in, whose instrument hasn't been properly tuned. What are you seeing from him right now?
I think it's a reflection on how difficult it's been for him to integrate into the Chelsea lineup. And the reason for this is partly because at Leverkusen, he was a really multi-dimensional player. So he was playing as a 6, he was playing as an 8, a 10, a false 9, an inside right. And he was very much the man at Leverkusen around whom everything was constructed. He was clearly the best player in the squad, even at such a young age. He was the leading scorer for Leverkusen in the season before he signed for Chelsea. And so it was very natural that everything was constructed around him. That not being the case at Chelsea, I think, has made that transition harder.
Dom, obviously over the summer, Chelsea spent in excess of £200 million, and Havertz is one of many new players in that squad. How do you rate his entry into the Premier League in relation to those other players?
He's probably found it the hardest of the group. I think that's fairly obvious when you look at the respective performances. We're seeing Timo Werner scoring goals regularly now, whether he's used off the left or through the middle. Ben Chilwell has arguably been their most consistent player and filled a massive problem position for them at left back since the Marcus Alonso and Emerson Palmieri experiments didn't work. Thiago Silva's had a huge impact at the back. They're suddenly a lot more secure. Edouard Mendy is, it's pretty easy to replace someone like Kepa whose confidence was so shattered, but everything that Mendy has done so far has been impressive. And Ziyech is, in the last few weeks, has really just taken off. His performances have flown off the right. So those guys have all made a very favourable impression. The irony being that Havertz actually did start pretty much with a hat-trick in one of his early games, but we haven't seen anything close to his best yet. He was the signing that carried the most mystique. He was the one that the Chelsea support were most excited about over the summer. He cost the most. He could end up being Chelsea's most expensive signing, potentially, if the add-ons all kick in. And yet he's the one of those new arrivals that has really yet to demonstrate the pedigree that we all know that he's got. We want to see that more of that in Chelsea colours from now on.
Alex, is one of the problems, or issues, not problem, it's not so severe, but the Kai Havertz, the Leverkusen Kai Havertz used to be shifted around. He was a tool which they were able to move into different positions and extract production from wherever they placed him. Is that lack of definition in relation to a lot of other players that come in at Chelsea who are there to service quite a specific need? Is that one of the reasons why there's been a little bit of a slow start here?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, there are two different reasons that a manager moves players around. Sometimes that's because there are gaps that have developed in the squad, and there are players who have sufficient quality to be able to plug those as and when is required. Someone like Havertz is more where you want to put him where you can most exploit whatever the opposition is weak at. So he's not a gap filler. He's a person who you will play as an 8 if you want those surging runs from central midfield. You'll play as a 9 if you think you can pull the opposition central defenders forwards and create space in behind. And that's one of the things that Leverkusen were really exceptional at doing, was making space for Havertz to then be able to play other players in. There were systems that were geared to exploit his ability to operate between the lines. So, for example, if we look at the 4-2-3-1, which is one of the main systems, this is the sort of Havertz space here. And one of the ways that happens is that, if you've got quick runners like, Diaby or Leon Bailey or Amiri running in behind, and Kevin Folland, who's a very, very able central striker, a very physical striker as well, what you're doing is moving everybody back so that, Havertz has then got this whole realm of space in which to operate. And the reason he wants that space is twofold. It's firstly because it allows him to pick these passes and release the quick guys in behind, or it's because he is then able to surge forwards and enter the box. And he has a really good goal-scoring record as a result of that, and with headers as well as first-time finishes with his feet. So he needs that space in which to operate, and the team has to be geared towards creating that. At Chelsea, that's not happening in the same way.
What's interesting to me about him is that he's one of the few examples of a notional number 10 who is really more of a goal scorer than a creative player. I know both elements of a game can coexist. Like, you can be a creative player who scores a lot of goals, but which part of his game did Chelsea need to emphasise?
That's an impossible question to answer. Sorry, on the basis that you can only answer that question if you're looking at what the rest of the team is doing, how you're deploying everybody else. Arguably, with Timo Werner, with Tammy Abraham, Pulisic coming in off the left-hand side, there are goals in that team. So is that what you want him to be doing? I mean, if he's playing as an 8 who can arrive late, which to me feels probably like the most sensible role, and one that you would hope Lampard would be able to coach very ably, that ability to, because Timo Werner is very, very fast. Pulisic is very fast and direct. What you want is for those guys to be either able to make runs in behind off the shoulder and get past the last line of defence, or to drag the last line of defence so far back that your late arriving players, like a Havertz or a Mason Mount, are able to shoot from the edge of the box or slightly further in. That's what Havertz excels at. Now, as we've said at Leverkusen, that ability to play between the lines was used in different positions. But I think what Chelsea really arguably need to be doing with a player of Havertz's quality is picking the position that they really want him to occupy. The Chelsea squad is better than the Leverkusen squad, although there were some great players in that. He's stepped up now, and in order to do that, he needs to solidify a position or have one solidified for him, and then operate consistently in that position, and Chelsea can then work their tactics out around that.
Okay, Alex, how are we fitting all these Chelsea pieces together? Because one of the good problem, I guess, one of the good problems to develop is Hakim Ziyech's start. He's played very, very well. He started his career at Chelsea really strongly. And there's a little bit of overlap there, because obviously Ziyech plays from the right most of the time, and Havertz has always had that tendency to drift into those areas. How do you fit this jigsaw together?
So
or how would you?
How would I?
Yeah.
Well, so if we look at what he tended to do at Leverkusen, where we've got him here as a number 10, the outside players, 11 and 7 here, were very much about pace. And then, what Havertz is always looking to do is play those players in here and here. If the centre forward is sort of pinning players back, that creates that space. Unfortunately, kind of unfortunately, because Ziyech is a really good player, but let's assume that these red guys are still Chelsea. What Ziyech is looking to do is not run in behind. He's looking to move into this sort of central area here, or the right half space. Now, you can still have a player who's nice and direct, like Pulisic, coming around on that side, but it does mean that it's congesting that right half space. I think from that perspective, whether you're playing Havertz as a 10 or as an 8, it makes a lot more sense to have Havertz on the left-hand side of that midfield. The problem with that is that, that's Mason Mount's spot if he's playing there. Kovacic also has a tendency to play on the left-hand side of a midfield 3. But what you can do then is you have a situation where Havertz is moving up into space here, Ziyech is drifting into space here, and then the dynamism is coming on the left-hand side from that player there or through the centre. Again, a slight issue because Werner has a tendency to drift left. So what we're talking about here is quite a subtle series of positional problems that is tricky for Lampard to figure out. What you don't want is to have a team that's massively stacked towards attacking on the left-hand side. At the same time, if you have Ziyech and Havertz drifting into the same spaces, you're going to nullify the abilities of both of them.
So this is kind of a blind spot, which I think I probably share with a lot of people. But when a new player comes into the league, and especially when he's a player of that kind of profile, I tend only to focus on what he does with the ball or his very obvious, very sort of deliberate movements. What is Kai Havertz off the ball? What is his value to Chelsea without possession?
So I think it's twofold. Firstly, a player of Havertz's quality is always going to attract opposition attention. So when Leverkusen used a 3-4-3, which they did quite often, and Havertz would play as the false nine in that position, he would drift forwards. That would do one of two things. Either one of the centre-backs would drift with him, in which case you've got a massive space to come through here, or that centre-back would not do that, and you'd have one of the midfielders dropping off, at which point Leverkusen can then outnumber that central midfielder and have domination in that position. Again, as a 10, if Havertz is there, you've got the same point. One of those central midfielders is dropping off. That allows Leverkusen's double pivot to have supremacy, or one of the centre-backs is pushing forwards, in which case Volland is one-on-one against a centre-back and you can have players running in behind. The other thing that Havertz does is he's really, really fast. I think the Bundesliga clocked him at around 35 kilometres an hour, possibly the fastest player in the Bundesliga in that season. I think it was 2018-19. That is extraordinary pace.
That's amazing, given the players he plays with as well, because that Leverkusen side, Diaby, Bailey, these are seriously quick footballers.
Absolutely, yeah. And he was the quickest of them. And so what that means is that Havertz, without the ball, is able to drift into those pockets of space and then suddenly accelerate forwards. And, if you've got players like Diaby and Bailey that are pinning the defence back, you've got Volland making a nuisance of himself, suddenly to have Havertz appearing. The other thing that he does really intelligently, and I think it's worth noting, is that he's got extraordinary judgment for when to make that run forwards, and also crucially which part of the penalty area to appear in. So it's not necessarily just a dynamic run from sort of this position and ending up boom right here in the centre, which is what you'd expect. If the opposition are being dragged over to the right hand side, then Havertz is quite happy to make a run round that sees him kind of come from this position inside. He's appearing where the gaps are, and then he has the technical ability to finish it. That if you watch the goals that he scored for Leverkusen, he'll do a half volley from the edge of the box, or he'll have a cute little lob from the right hand side of the penalty area. Like he's very technically accomplished.
There was a goal he scored for Germany on a recent international break. I think it was against Switzerland, where he picked the ball up on the kind of shallow right side of the attacking third, and he drove with it right almost to the byline before beating the keeper from quite a narrow angle. Like it's interesting to find a player that has such a good touch, such good awareness, the anticipation you've mentioned, but also the ability to actually drive with the ball. That's it almost feels like often you find those attributes in separate players.
Yeah, and I think this is part of the problem. When you're talking about, and we alluded to this at the beginning, Havertz can do everything more capably than most players can do one thing, which is a fantastic acquisition, but it also makes it really, really difficult to think, this is where I'm going to put him. And this is why I think, Lampard selling himself as the guy who can coach him how to be an 8. Obviously, as well, Michael Ballack, who was him at Leverkusen 10 years previously, 15 years previously, and then played over 100 games for Chelsea. He's actually probably the archetype that Lampard should be appealing to in terms of, Havertz, you can be the next Ballack for Germany, for Chelsea, and make that role your own.
Funny, not in an athletic sense, because the player I'm going to mention was, not athletically the best. He reminds me of Rafa van der Vaart in a way that, not in stature, but in the positions he occupied and the way he used to pivot around either like wingers or whoever was playing in front of him as a centre forward. He has that same kind of weird chemistry, it seems. Volland, but you think of the way that Van der Vaart worked with Crouch when he was at Tottenham. Different calibre of player, I accept that, but it's very, very similar. Dom, one thing's, it's a kind of tenuous part of this conversation, but it's an important one. What's going on behind Havertz? Because it feels like Chelsea's deep midfield has been the point of discussion for about 3 or 4 years now. Like, what is Lampard settling on in that area?
I think he's gravitated towards N'Golo Kanté as a sitting midfielder in a 3 in recent weeks, having experimented a bit over the first couple of months of the season. He's also got the option to go 3 at the back as well. But I think that with Kanté sitting deeper as a 6, and maybe Mason Mount on one side and Kai Havertz on the other, that combination seemed to be the most comfortable. That seemed to be getting the best out of the most players in this setup, especially now that Ziyech has stated his case for inclusion on the right of the front 3. So I suspect that's the way it'll go. I don't think it's ultimately what he would want to do. I mean, he's constantly linked with Declan Rice for a reason. I think he'd offer more of a defensive shield than N'Golo Kanté does in a very different way. But I think the fact they've got Thiago Silva at centre half now really helps them out, because he can organise better across that back line, and maybe they can use Kanté in that sort of, I don't want to say destructive, because he's not a destructive midfielder, is he? But he's the scuttling, energetic, dynamic presence there, and allow others to meander forwards from that.
Alex, I guess what this is leading to is to try and establish what it is that someone like Havertz needs as a platform, and what ingredients need to exist around him for Chelsea to be able to see the best of him, and for them, more importantly, probably to put him in the right positions to be of influence. So what are you supporting him with? Again, this is your build.
So I think you need to have a stable, solid defensive presence at the base of midfield, whether that's in a 2 or a 3. At Leverkusen, he had the Bender brothers, he had Baumgartlinger, even Aranguiz, who's kind of a playmaker, was not shabby in those defensive duties. That gives him a solid platform. Maybe that's why Chelsea are still looking at Declan Rice, but N'Golo Kanté can do that for the time being. Mason Mount's industry and pressing, I think, makes a lot of sense in a midfield 3 that can look a little bit like a double pivot in transition, because Mount is a really tactically astute player and an excellent presser of the ball, and I think that works well. What you want to be able to do is to be able to release Havertz, to push forwards, to find the space. I would also argue that, yes, while Ziyech is a fantastic player, and I really, really like him, it wouldn't surprise me if for some games, particularly games where teams are maybe a little bit more expansive or looking to come forwards a bit more, you actually go for increased pace on the right-hand side. Now, that might mean that you play Werner on the left and Pulisic on the right, and then have Abraham in the centre. It could mean having Hudson-Odoi coming in on the right with Pulisic on the left. But I think what Havertz needs is players that are capable of making surging runs in behind and really scaring opposition defences. Ziyech, for all his passing ability, isn't that player. So that, I would be looking to construct a team of that nature. So it would sort of look a little bit like this, I think. The pace is coming from these wide areas. You've got a shielding 6 here. I think it is worth noting that if you play Ziyech on the right-hand side and tucking in, Reece James is a very, very dynamic right-back, so you can get the width and the thrust there. And then Havertz, probably on this left-hand side, he's got the freedom to push up. He can operate in this space here. He can make his late runs into the box, and I think that's probably what Chelsea should be looking to do.
If you're playing with a lot of beyond the last man pace in the attacking third, is there an argument for saying maybe in certain games that Chelsea might employ a more conservative fullback behind him? As you say, like Reece James is very aggressive, very talented, and beyond the halfway line.
I mean, I think Reece James is developing into a really, really strong player. So I think if you say to Reece James, I want you to hold your position and tuck inside a little bit, he's capable of doing that. Yeah, so I would play Werner up front. I think Abraham is a good option if you're looking to have a more physical presence up there, but Werner has the pace to run in behind. Pulisic on the left-hand side. I think for form reasons at the moment, Ziyech does get the nod in the right spot. Havertz back here, Mason Mount on the right-hand side of that midfield, and Kanté screening at the back.
Let's go back a few steps, Dom, and approach this from a slightly broader angle. What was the start point of Chelsea's interest in Kai Havertz?
Well, it goes back a long way. We're talking 2 or 3 years probably. Chelsea's recruitment department, like elite clubs across the Premier League is fairly extensive. Their scouting network is extensive. That they have been aware of Havertz's burgeoning talent for some time. I'm not sure they always thought that he was a player they were able to attract to Stamford Bridge, but that situation changed really over the summer, where they got the right noises back from his people. Maybe actually we should go back further to pandemic time, actually, because I know we've had 2 summer breaks virtually. And I think the fact that, you know, all the other elite clubs out there that have been linked with him and had an interest in him, your Real Madrids, your Barcelonas, they weren't in a position to go out and spend what Leverkusen wanted, which was essentially 100 million euros. Chelsea, on the other hand, were. They still had the money in their burning a hole in their pockets from Eden Hazard's sale to Real Madrid, and so they had funds available, and they could go and do that, and they could sell the club, and give the sales pitch to Kai Havertz and his people. And a player that was possibly instinctively more inclined to go to a Real Madrid suddenly became quite attracted to the idea of coming to Chelsea and being another young player in a developing team, a progressive team, a team with a clear philosophy, because Lampard could tell him that this is what I want to do in the next few years. You will be a key part of that. And, you know, you'll earn a good wage while you're at it as well. So I think it all played into Chelsea's favour. And, you know, Scott McLaughlin and the scouting department and the recruitment department at Chelsea deserve huge credit for that. But the very fact they had the resources to go out and sign a stellar talent like Havertz really reflects on where Chelsea are as a club.
Lampard's role in recruitment, or his influence on recruitment and getting deals over the line, it fascinates me because like Alex mentioned earlier that if Chelsea needed to adapt him into a kind of more of a number 8, who better to try and coach someone like Kai Havertz than Frank Lampard? But is that something that we imagine in the media? Because is it the case that, like, for someone like Kai Havertz, who grew up with Frank Lampard in his prime, is he an influential person in that way? Does he have that kind of influence over that younger generation of players?
I think we probably overplay it a bit, to be honest. I mean, I think most managers out there, when they're trying to attract a player of this calibre to their club, will probably make those phone calls, will probably sell the club's ideas and his own philosophy to that player to try and convince him to join. However, there must be an element for every player that when Frank Lampard rings you up and says, look, you can be the future of our midfield, of my team, and I'm Frank Lampard, by the way, that must play a part. I mean, it's got to. It would be ridiculous to suggest otherwise. So
I wonder if he talks like that. when he picks up the phone to a new player. Also, have you ever thought
I'm the bloke who scored that brilliant goal in the World Cup against Germany, which
but socially in that situation, that's got to be horrendous. Like, if you're so in that theoretical scenario, Chelsea and Leverkusen have been negotiating, and Marina Granovskaya, for instance, needs a little bit of help from a Lampard, and be like, can you just give him a call? So you've got Frank Lampard being asked to get on the phone to a young player. That's got to be the most wooden conversation
You know
ever.
what? It's an interesting... I mean, like you're talking about the chronology there. I suspect that this phone call probably happened before the clubs actually started talking. These days, you want to find out whether the player is actually open to the idea of joining you before you embarrass yourself for putting in a bid and he doesn't fancy it. So I imagine that those phone calls happened quite early on in the process, and possibly when Real Madrid was still on the scene, potentially, and might have lured into the Bernabeu instead. Possibly awkward, but, you know.
Do you reckon there's small talk as well? Do you reckon, like, because if you phoned me yesterday and we had about 5 minutes, how are you? And,
you convinced me to come here.
Yeah, exactly. And it's how's the weather? How's the family? Do you reckon they do that before they get, or is it straight into the kind of Frank Lampard here, I've won the European Cup, do you want to come to Chelsea? It might just have to be that direct.
I imagine there must be some small talk, but you've got me thinking now. This has got the workings of a 3,000 word athletic piece.